the attention span of an average human being might be lesser than that of a goldfish. Exactly does a brand strategist do? Some people think you're on ad shoots all day. Some people think you're working with celebrities. Some people think you're doing the P&L work. I think you're the best person to talk about it.
You have to be able to be mentally available for all consumers. That means that what are some of the things that you're going to do so that they start thinking of your brand before any other brand?
When you think of brands like Lifebuoy, what do you immediately think of? Batti Tera Sabun.
Yeah.
When you think of Surf Excel, you think of Dagache.
Yeah.
Today, we don't remember any of the advertising. So it's a fool's errand to try and chase memory structures because people don't remember anything.
What is the relevance of memory structures in an age of declining attention span? I would actually say that memory structures are even more important.
How likely is it then that an Indian brand is going to enter a new market and then adapt to that Western culture?
A great example of what just happened was Blue Tokai. It's an absolutely Indian brand.
Yeah.
What's interesting is Japan used to be a tea drinking country. The Japanese tea ceremonies are something that everybody knows. What is a coffee brand doing there?
Hello everybody, I'm Aalekh Tripathi and I welcome you to another insightful conversation into the world of marketing and business here at the Altera Institute. Today we have with us Aditya Banerjee, who's the Associate Vice President of Brand Strategy at one of India's leading creative agencies. Thank you Aditya for being here.
Very happy to be here, Aalekh.
Aditya, when we talk about brand strategy and marketing, it has a wide spectrum of how people interpret your work, right? Like what is it that a brand marketer does? Some people think you're on ad shoots all day. Some people think you're working with celebrities. Some people think you're doing the P&L work.
Yeah.
What exactly does a brand strategist do? And I think you're the best person to talk about it because you've worked on brands like Royal Enfield, 7-Up, H&M, and also Philips Grooming. So why don't you just explain for any of these brands what your work on brand strategy entails?
Actually, Aalekh, that's a question that everybody's been trying to answer. Even when I talk to my family and they ask, what do you actually do?
Yeah.
People are typically at a loss for words. What I found the simplest way to explain what a brand strategist actually does is to help any consumer think of a brand when they need to buy something. That's as simple as it can be, right? Because we have to realize that being in marketing, being in advertising, the layperson, the average person is not thinking about brands on a day-to-day basis, right? They're only thinking about their life, what they need, exactly how it should be. So a brand strategist's responsibility, and I would say marketing and advertising responsibility, is really to embed certain foundational memory structures so that the lay consumer thinks of your brand when they have a need.
Let's talk about one of the brands that you worked on, right? So let's take, for example, Philips Grooming as a brand. How does that happen at the back end? Like, how do you ensure that when a consumer is looking for a trimmer, she remembers or he remembers your brand? How does that work?
So typically there's a couple of things, right? You have to be able to be mentally available for all consumers. That means that when they feel that, okay, I need a trimmer, what are some of the things that you're going to do so that they start thinking of your brand before any other brand? For a brand like Philips, because especially Philips has been around for a while, some of the advantages that it brings with it are things like everybody's very aware of the brand name Philips, right? So the awareness of the brand itself is very high. So it helps us mitigate some of the challenges. But we've got to work doubly harder for a couple of other reasons as well, which is where some other memory structures come forth. The color form of Philips, the white and the blue, the shield, the stars of Philips, the line of innovation and new, the choice of celebrity that we use, like say Virat Kohli, who becomes really important, especially when you're talking about beard trimmers, because Virat's known for his beard. Yeah. He's known for somebody who is very well groomed. He's always looking sharp. He's always looking good. And even colloquially, if you ask most people who have a beard, that whose beard looks good, they typically say, Virat's got a great beard. He keeps it really nicely. And it's sort of something that gets attached to that person. And you start leveraging and using these. I think it's very important for these memory structures to be instilled and foundationally over a period of time for consumers to start remembering them. And that's the onus on the brand strategists, the marketing and advertising.
So for example, what you're saying, if I have to put it in different words, is that your job, one of the jobs as the brand strategist on Philips, has been to say that when somebody thinks of Philips, they think of Virat Kohli. When somebody thinks of Virat Kohli, they think of Philips.
Yes.
When somebody thinks of Philips, you think of the stars and the sheen and the innovation new line.
Yeah.
And that plays a part in driving business growth for the category.
Absolutely. And I'd say in the shopping journey, if we were to go even sort of in the pre-stages of the journey, right? people aren't thinking of, I want to buy Philips. People are thinking of, I want to get a good looking beard. So when they have that need, how do you get people to start thinking of Philips? How do you get the association of a good beard with Philips? That's the initial part. And then once people think of Philips, they're like, oh, okay, I remember seeing that ad with Virat. Virat's got a great beard. That's the kind of look that I'd also like to have. And that's sort of the little mental model or the mental journey that people go through when they're thinking of a beard.
Aditya, so I worked obviously at one of India's largest consumer goods firms. And one of the schools of thought is that when you think of brands like Lifebuoy, what do you immediately think of? Banti tera sabun slow hai kya? When you think of Surf Excel, you think of Dagache, almost instinctively, and you think of the Surf Excel Blue.
Correct.
Both of those happen to be from the house of brands, where, of course, HUL, where I worked at. One of the schools of thought is that, hey, today we don't remember any of the advertising, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that I mentioned ads that are a decade old, minimum, right? So one of the schools of thought is that, hey, no longer these memory structures can be built. Now there is a host of brands. There's a lot of content out there. So it's a fool's errand to try and chase memory structures because people don't remember anything. And there is some research to suggest that low attention spans and low memories are there. How in this world then do memory structures still hold relevance to drive any brand's growth?
That's a very interesting proposition there, right? And it's a very interesting challenge that everybody in marketing and advertising is sort of grappling with. What is the relevance of memory structures in an age of declining attention spans? I would actually say that memory structures are even more important, simply because people have less mental real estate to give anyway. A number of the places, touch points that we've got today to start leveraging memory structures, therefore, becomes extremely important. Today, we're at a point where it's very easy to create a product. It's getting increasingly easier to create software. So brands are almost becoming more important as a defensive moat. You have to create your brand as the one thing or a set of things that starts differentiating you from people. So I would say that a lot of other memory structures become more important. I'll give you a quick example. Mokobara is a brand that I personally really love. I have used the brand several times. Now, one of the things that Mokobara is associated with is the bright yellow. Everybody who's seen the advertising or anything, that bright yellow really stands out. And the fact that it's not just communications or not just mainline advertising, because they haven't done that, but social media, the kind of content that they put out, including when you buy a Mokobara bag, there's a little element of yellow somewhere or the other. If you happen to buy one of their backpacks, maybe the inner lining is yellow. In their cabin luggage, the inner lining of the suitcases is yellow. Sometimes just the tassel on the zipper is yellow. I think all of these play a small but very important role in getting the brand to click in people's minds and stay in people's minds.
So what you're saying essentially is that it's more of a competitive advantage now.
Absolutely.
Because we are remembering lesser, that is almost true.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if you can get yourself embedded in the consumer's memory, that can be a competitive advantage.
100%. Especially in an age where you have so many brands that are being created. I mean, look around at the country that we are in, right? There's so many amazing brands on Shark Tank, so many indie startups that are coming up. So there are more and more brands clamoring for the same mental real estate. You have to stake a piece as your own and sort of mark your territory. I think that's supremely interesting.
But that's easier said than done,
It's
right?
easier said than done.
Obviously, TVCs used to be 30-second long. Then you'd have 20-second cuts and 10-second cuts. Now we know that the attention span of an average human being might be lesser than that of a goldfish. It's less than 8 seconds, as per some studies. In that world, when a consumer is giving you 8 seconds of attention to any piece of content that they're seeing, less than that, how do you make sure that you're able to build these memory structures? Because the challenge is real. I remember Dagache and Banti Sabun Slow Hai Kya because I've seen it over and over again over 30 seconds. If you ask me what I saw in the morning on my way, on my commute on Instagram or YouTube, I would not remember instinctively, right? Then how is it that we're expecting consumers to remember brands and then actually think of them when they're about to make a purchase?
I think there's another layer to this as well. One layer, of course, or one conversation is memory structures. The other is that you have to think consumer backward. You have to think of the culture. You have to think of the place that you're in and what's relevant to them. Inarguably, the kind of work that was done with Dagache, with Har Ghar Kuch Kehta Hai, was because they started from a very human place.
Yeah.
When they said dirt is good or daag achhe hain, it really resonated with people, not because you've used the same colors over and over again, but the fact that you're able to reach out and connect to somebody at a human level. The same with Har Ghar Kuch Kehta Hai.
Yeah.
The fact that they turned the entire conversation from not just paint on walls, but the people living inside those houses who make it homes.
Yeah.
So when you start doing work like that, I think that really connects. And I also would wager a significant amount of money that when you're able to connect with somebody, they actually give you more of their time. They start doing that because you've been able to create that consumer connect, that cultural connect for any brand.
If memory structures or brand recall now is a function of so many different touch points and not just a piece of advertising that you put out or content, one has to wonder what the role of global brands and global memory structures are. So, for example, a lot of people might not know this, but a lot of consumer brands are global, right? So, not just brands that we know and love, like say Coca-Cola and McDonald's, etc. But even household brands. So, for example, Surf Excel is a global brand. It's called different names in different countries, but dirt is good or daag achhe is there in all countries.
Correct.
Likewise for Dove, likewise for a L'Oreal, likewise for Maybelline. If you just have to think from first principles, how and why does it make sense for us to be building the same memory structure, say in a Western Europe, and as in India? How does that make sense for a brand, and how is it relevant to drive growth?
So a couple of reasons why brands need to do that. Number one, of course, brands tend to traverse the globe purely for business reasons. It's good for the balance sheet, right? But at another level, why brands keep the same memory structures, I think the reason is a composite of business reasons and brand creation reasons. At a business level, of course, it's very efficient use of marketing monies. You'd have to work less hard to get people to remember the same things, especially with the increasing exposure to global brands in today's day and age. Let's go back a couple of years when Starbucks entered the country. People still knew the Starbucks logo, the colors. They knew a lot of the drinks simply because it's there on content. So when Starbucks came to this country, they had a slightly easier job. The logo was the same. The store was the same. People knew what to expect there. And that sense of familiarity is very important in terms of brand. It creates trust. It builds a certain amount of confidence. It tells you exactly in your own mind where this brand is placed. When I walk into a Starbucks, am I going to get a certain premium kind of coffee, customized orders, freshly roasted, freshly grounded beans? Or am I going to get quick on-the-go coffee like, say, Nescafe does? So it helps consumers in their little mental map that they have at the back of their minds. I think another reason as to why these memory structures are important is because not just in terms of business, not just in terms of familiarity, but brands are able to tap into the same emotions over and over again. And we all know that emotions are a very big part of brand creation. If you're able to do that, research has shown again and again that across metrics, emotion drives profit. Emotion is good for brands and business. So I think those are some of the reasons why brands need to keep those memory structures alive and keep them consistent all over the world. A great example, I think, of a brand that's done that is McDonald's. You just mentioned that brand. The red and the yellow is iconic. They've kept the same tagline of "I'm loving it" over years. But if you look at the conversations that they've had, whether it's McDonald's or whether it's even McCafe, we were just talking about the level at which McCafe has localized conversations. About 6-7 years ago, when McCafe ran conversations and ads and comms in UK, they said that the whole theme of the message was that specialty coffee is everywhere. It's very pretentious and nobody can wait 20 minutes for a cup of coffee when you're on the go. And people wanted quick coffee, hot coffee, delivered at an affordable price. That's all. At the same time, when McCafe was talking in India, the conversation was exactly the opposite. They said that we do have 100% Arabica beans that are roasted to perfection, that's ground to perfection, and we deliver it in the cup in the same time. So I think those cultural nuances that McCafe has kept of understanding where the business and cultural cycle is in UK and where the business and cultural cycle is in India is very important. Simply because it's food. It's so tied to local cultures. It's so tied to the local palate. It's an important conversation and it's an important localization to have while still driving the same brand.
Food is, of course, one of the categories where localization is most often talked about,
Mhm.
and we've seen that. We've seen, for example, KFC have
Yeah.
a vegetarian range.
Yeah.
We've seen Subway have tandoori ranges,
Yeah.
and even the McAloo tikki itself
Yeah.
exists only in India. It's one of those things when you go abroad and you go into McDonald's, you're surprised that
Yeah.
there's no aloo tikki
There's
here.
no aloo tikki.
In fact, there might not be a vegetarian burger in a lot
Correct.
of countries in
Correct.
McDonald's, right? But even if we transcend food and if we transcend
Hmm.
categories, I'm sure a global brand entering a new market,
Hmm.
there must be a lot of challenges in how you adapt to
Mhm.
local, because you have a particular set of memory structures, a particular set of brand assets that are building those memory structures,
Yeah.
which you might have to change, because if you think about a market in isolation,
Hmm.
it might not work very well,
Yeah.
right? How does that process flow? Have you worked on a global brand, for example,
Sure.
where that's happened?
I think one of the most interesting brands that we did this with was H&M. Right? If you look at H&M's entire journey, it's a global brand. It didn't exist in India for the longest period of time. Now, when H&M did enter the country, there was a lot of excitement around the brand because people were familiar with it, people had seen it. But I think what led H&M to establish its presence, not initially, but over a course of time, was understanding a couple of things about Indian culture. Number one, the fact that the festival period is extremely important
Yeah.
to us. We all love dressing up for Diwali. We love dressing up for the card parties that happen. We love dressing up for friends, for family, when we're in office. And this entire period has a sense of joviality to it.
Yeah.
Right? You're extremely, we love celebration as Indians. And what H&M did was create specific ranges and communication that tapped into this very sentiment. They said that we've got a Diwali edit. They launched communications right before the festival period that said that, we know that all of these parties are coming up. You want to look your best, and guess what? H&M has your back. And work like this really allowed a brand that's very European in its sensibilities to come and tap into a sensibility that's extremely Indian. They could have gone with, we make very cheap clothes, make very affordable lines, we've got good designs.
Yeah.
They could have even spoken about sustainability, because very often the clothes that we wear for festivals are clothes that you wear maybe 3-4 times a year. They could have spoken about all of this. But the insight into the market of knowing what people wear at what time of the year and why they do it was a beautiful instance of a global brand localizing itself so well to local tastes.
How likely is it then that an Indian brand is going to enter a new market, maybe, and then adapt to that Western culture, just as Western brands are adapting to an Indian culture? Are we seeing that in any of the categories, and how does that pan out?
I think that's definitely happening. At a certain level, yes, India is making its presence felt at a global stage. A lot of our businesses are going abroad. Some businesses are already there. For example, TCS. It exists in a lot of partnerships. Consumers perhaps don't get to see it because it's a B2B brand.
Yeah.
But if you look at their processes in the back end, TCS knows exactly how to change the sales process, how to change the pitching process when they're talking to someone from the States, someone from Europe, even across different sensibilities in Europe, where you might have to pitch a product in a slightly different way. And of course, how business and work is done in India. I think this is going to happen only more and more. A great example of what just happened was Blue Tokai. It's an absolutely Indian brand.
Yeah.
It's a brand that I love. I have been consuming as a real coffee aficionado for a while. I love Blue Tokai coffee. And it's great to see the footprints that they're starting to make in a place like Japan. What's interesting is twofold. A, Blue Tokai has understood the fact that when you go to Japan, you've got to change even the aesthetics. Right? Because the Japanese have a different kind of aesthetics. It's very minimal in some way, shape, or form. So they have adapted there. What's also interesting, and it might come as a surprise to most people, that Japan used to be a tea drinking country. The Japanese tea ceremonies are something that everybody knows. What is a coffee brand doing there? What's a coffee brand doing there? And
how does it make itself relevant to a tea loving nation?
And that conversation was actually taken care of by Nescafe. When Nescafe entered or thought of entering Japan, it faced this exact challenge. How does a coffee brand sell itself in a tea loving country? And Nescafe realized that the notion of tea exists very well with adults, but it doesn't exist with children. So they started making coffee flavored desserts for kids, but kids would like. And then they got that slight taste of coffee. They started falling in love with it. And today, I believe Japan is one of the top performing countries for Nescafe as a brand. And now Blue Tokai is sort of making its way there with a lot of specialty coffee. Now, I'm sort of familiar with the Japanese coffee industry. Japan and coffee are so deeply entrenched now that some of the world's best coffee bars are in Japan. The processes, the kind of coffee flavors that they have, the washes of coffee, the altitude, the varietals of coffee that they have is insane.
Aditya, then is it fair to say that Japan's coffee evolution or the stage of coffee consumption is either ahead or different from what it is in India?
Yeah, I'd say it's different. I wouldn't say one is ahead of the other or one is behind the other, but I'd say it's very different and it's beautiful in the way it's progressing. Today, we've got a large number of Indians who've fallen in love with specialty coffee, who are very particular about the kind of coffee that they have. I, for example, my days start with instant coffee from Nescafe, but I typically close out my days and my weekends look like somebody's gone absolutely crazy with coffee.
Yeah.
A mocha pot, a French press, an AeroPress, measuring every single bean, being particular where I source my coffee from, if it's sustainable or not. Those are conversations that are definitely happening with me and are happening with a lot of Indians. If you go to the Japanese side of conversations, they've got extreme precision, attention to detail about what kind of coffee is used, the process that's being followed, how they can give you a complete coffee experience that is not just the coffee in the cup, but what are you smelling along with it? What are the aromas that you're smelling? What is the environment in which you're consuming it? And they've also taken coffee to a luxury level where a cup of coffee might cost several thousand rupees just for 100 milliliters of coffee. So very different trajectories and very interesting in two countries that are primarily tea/chai loving.
Yeah. And in that context now, if Blue Tokai is looking at entering Japan, for example, their strengths or the way that they stand, the memory structures that they have worked really hard to build in India, maybe need to be adapted for Japan. How does a brand even begin to do that? Should it be called Blue Tokai in Japan or not? Like, what is the process on why should it not be called Red Tokai for the red in the Japan's flag, right? How does the process happen and how is that decision making done?
So sometimes some of the memory structures, the explicit memory structures, they need to be consistent and similar. So your logo, your name, the shape of the logo, for example, it's in a lot of places for Blue Tokai, it's circular. So those are some of the things that can stay consistent. But I think the biggest hallmark is what are the people like there? What's the culture like there? From there, from a consumer backward kind of thinking, that's where you get to what are the changes that I need to make. If people already receive something positively in that shape, in that place, don't mess around with it. But the other things you might want to say that, okay, this is a particular kind of coffee. If, for example, when you're entering a new market, you discover that they don't like milk-based coffees. So then maybe you reduce that in the menu, similar to how McDonald's does. It localizes the menu. The examples that we just spoke of, McDonald Tiki Burger is not there everywhere in the world.
Right.
So when specific kinds of coffee enters different markets around the world, Blue Tokai might go and say, or any brand might go and say that we won't have this on the menu. Instead, why don't we have a matcha flavored coffee? Because we know that that's a flavor that the Japanese love. It's a deeply entrenched part of their culture. It's going to taste like home instead of tasting alien. So having a culture backward or consumer backward way of thinking, I'd say is the best way to figure out what should stay and what should be put aside.
And how much of this stems from just category consumption and studying that versus, say, studying culture? Because this seems fairly objective and straightforward that, of course, Japanese drink matcha, then we should include matcha because that's where the category construct is, right? How much of when a brand is adapting to a new market comes from cultural nuances which might be more difficult to study than, say, reading a Euromonitor report to figure out what people are consuming?
100%, right? So when you're looking at some of the smaller aspects or the minutiae of any brand, then you've got to start deciding, okay, what are some of the conversations that we want to have? Yeah. What are some of the conversations which should be consistent? And what are some of the conversations that we might want to change? For example, let's talk about a global brand that's localized well, McDonald's, right? Let's stay consistent with that. McDonald's has realized that when you talk about family values all over the world, it resonates with most people.
Yeah.
Which is why whether you see an ad in the States, whether you see an ad in China or India, the conversations of family values, bonds with friends, these are some of the things that stay consistent. They're not going to mess around with that because they've analyzed culture through different tools and they've figured out what works. One of the most important cultural expositions that you might want to have when you're analyzing a culture is the Hofstede framework. The Hofstede framework looks at the symbols, the rituals, the heroes, and the beliefs of any culture. And that's a very deep insight and deep look into the culture that you're looking at when you look at these 3-4 pillars. So when you start looking at some of these frameworks, when you start applying some of these frameworks, you understand how you should shape your brand accordingly.
And of course, this doesn't apply only to communication, but to product innovation as well.
Yes,
even
absolutely.
outside of food. Food, of course, has, for example, vegetarian preferences and non-vegetarian preferences. But even outside of food categories, in how the product innovations are decided, which categories one enters and does not enter, I'm sure culture plays a role there also.
Culture plays a huge role. For example, when we were working with Nissan it's a Japanese brand.
Yeah.
It's a very well-built Japanese brand, and different parts of the world have different kinds of strengths. For example, if you go to Dubai, the Nissan Patrol is hugely celebrated there. It's an iconic car all over Dubai, all over Middle East. When you look at the States, the Nissan X-Trail and different markets, the X-Trail is one of the world's highest selling SUVs. However, when you come to India and you look at shades of X-Trail Patrol, you look at the portfolio and see that Nissan has just introduced the X-Trail. That's a product point of view that we've had. You see that even the conversations that we've begun to have with Nissan in the country, they've managed to adapt to a lot of Indian conversations for a very long period of time. Way back then, when Nissan introduced the Magnite in 2020, the conversation was around the fact that we love to celebrate. The whole line that it went with was big, bold, beautiful. And we realized that when Indians look for cars, we look for something that is designed beautifully. It looks great. It should have a commanding road presence. The cultural point was that India is in a point of transition from sedans to SUVs. At one point, you'll remember that sedans used to communicate esteem, used to communicate class.
Yeah.
The whole question was, gaadi kitni lambi hai, right? Limousines were amazing.
Yeah.
There was Maruti's car, it was literally called Esteem. However, today the conversation in culture is not gaadi kitni lambi, it's gaadi kitni uchi hai.
Right.
Cars need to communicate power.
Yeah.
They need to communicate stature, stance. They have to have a commanding presence, which is why you see so many SUVs on the road, which is why all these SUVs, they have a certain kind of communication, a certain way of speaking, right? Very interestingly, over a certain period, I think the last year and a half, a lot of brands have launched black editions, cars with completely black finishes, and it looks really good. A lot of consumers love that look because it dials up the quote-unquote SUV-ness of a car.
Yeah, and just the masculinity, right? That's a color that is associated with masculinity.
Yeah.
Of course, Vim had launched that campaign, dummy campaign also on dishwasher for men with it being black. Exactly. But you're right that some of those cultural nuances might be specific. This chase of power and stance and stature might not be happening in all countries at the same time as much as it's happening in India. Maybe then, as a brand, you have global aspirations. Maybe you have to be also mindful of picking symbols and assets that do transfer well to other markets. So, for example, if you're picking a mascot, if you're picking a particular color, also colors can be very tricky as well. Then do you keep in mind that, hey, if I tomorrow go to my next set of target countries, I need to be mindful that it might need to be there. So, for example, the Air India Maharaja is there, right? Now, of course, Indian culture is very well known, but it doesn't transfer very well. Like if you're in Heathrow, it's not a very aspirational thing to associate with the Air India Maharaja for anybody who's not Indian, right? So when brands are thinking about mascots, etc., also is this something which is at play, which is how do I pick something which appeals to global audiences, which is why we see so many non-human or non-realistic mascots, because those are culturally the same across the board.
I think that works pretty well. You know, one of the brands that's brought back a mascot is 7-Up. A couple of years ago, they brought back Fido.
Yeah. Sorry, Fido is a 7-Up mascot.
Yeah. Fido, Dido, Fido, Dido. It's got so many different names. But everybody, when you look at a 7-Up ad, especially one that's been released over the past couple of years, 5-6 years, that mascot's been brought back and plays an integral role in moving the narrative in any piece of communications forward.
I remember Fido. I never realized that he was moved out to begin with, because when I think of 7-Up, I still think of that that creature, right? Why was it moved back? What was the context in which it was brought back?
So I think everybody realized that Fido had a lot of potential, and it was a memory structure that was associated with the brand. Great reason to bring it back, differentiates you from competition, and ultimately, if the people are responding, if anybody's responding well to it, then of course it makes your brand, going back to what we started with, it's a little easier to recognize your brand and think of your brand when you have that quote-unquote purchase occasion, if I've got to use jargon. So that's why Fido was brought back and plays a role in today's communication for 7-Up.
So, Aditya, that seems so obvious that a brand should do that, which is that if you have a memory structure that is sitting in people's mind, you should leverage it. You should leverage it to build recall. Why do brands then drop mascots at all? We've seen the Zuzu exist and then not exist. We saw Fido exit the common parlance and communication for 7-Up. Why do brands do that? Why not just double down and keep building that with that association?
As far as the Zuzus go, that's a great question. I'm not sure why the Zuzus were dropped. I do think it had a huge amount of recall for Vodafone, as did the Pug. I suspect that when maybe during the time of the merger, if something was happening, the acquisition, something was happening, and they had to sort of keep some of the things which were common to both. But I'm not super sure as to why those specific mascots were dropped. But the fact remains that these are great memory structures. Now, the question of if you have a memory structure, leverage it. I think the question is, how do you develop memory structures? Number one. Number two, how do you make sure that they are owned by your brand and nobody else can own them? I think Coca-Cola has done a great job of doing that. They've really, really done a great job of making sure that the bottle of the Coca-Cola, mostly Coke is consumed in cans. I haven't seen a Coke bottle in some time. But the Coke bottle, the shape of it is so iconic that they ran a full campaign which just had the word Coca-Cola on a red background, and you think of Coke. You know exactly what the shape of the bottle is. They've done a great job of that. The cursive font, the red and white color combination, and the font I think was created from scratch. The words Coca-Cola, the alliteration, very specific intentional choices which have played out well. I think the biggest thing with memory structures is that if you're not consistent with them, it's not going to stick. And I think that's one of the greatest shortcomings when people start thinking of brand building and marketing, is that if you're not consistent, people won't remember it.
And actually, if you look at the conventional wisdom today, a lot of assets are not consistent, right? You have, because brands are leveraging things like UGC or user-generated content and influencer marketing, every creator might give their own flavor to the brand communication. So, for example, I work with a lot of beauty brands, and beauty is a category that works a lot on influencer marketing. One of the challenges is, how do you make sure that the particular creator stays true to her audience, but also communicates the right brand codes, right? And that is really a big challenge that conventional marketing wisdom fails to sort of tackle, right? Because what conventional marketing wisdom is exactly what you said, which is be consistent. But consistent is also boring, right? Consistent does not get engagement. Consistent does not get traffic on your website.
100%.
How are you then managing consistency with newness and newsworthiness on platforms like social media?
Great question, So I think when it comes to collaborating with any sort of influencer, any partner for that matter, your brand needs to be strong. And when I say strong, I don't mean it needs to be rigid. I mean, the outlines of it has to be defined really well to give that content creator the flexibility of how he or she is going to mold the brand according to their style. Because at the end of the day, if you're going through the channel of an influencer, you're also borrowing some of their personality. You're in fact relying on their reach, their personality, the kind of conversation that they have. So it has to be a collaboration, it has to be a partnership. You cannot impose brand guidelines and brand rules. I mean, then what's the point of an influencer, right? You're just doing it for reach. You're not doing it for narrative. You're not doing it for story. You're not doing it really for brand building then.
And for reach, influencer is a very expensive mechanism just to buy.
It is. Exactly. So I think the flexibility of the brand needs to be there. And I think one of the ways a brand can stay consistent as well as current is to have a very firm eye on what's happening. Like today, brands, the velocity at which brands move on social is insanely high.
Yeah.
People are pumping out content and doing a great job of it at that. I think to be able to look at what are the things that are trending, which are the trends that we should be a part of, and which are the trends that we should not be a part of, which is equally important. I think that decides how a brand can stay current, still be really fun, as well as be consistent with the memory structures. I think that's the sort of balance that brands need to get today.
That sounds like challenging stuff, Aditya.
Yeah.
Now, you've been working in marketing and advertising for over 7 years. You're a B school grad yourself. You graduated from MICA. Tell me, when you entered this sector or this career, there might be a lot of people who are aspiring for a career in this field listening to you. How was the skill set that you had or you needed to succeed different 7-8 years ago versus what you see in your team today?
So one of the things that is that when I look at brands today and branding and marketing today, it's a combination of two things. I feel that I love building brands. I love looking at a piece of, at a brand, looking at what they need, the objectives, working backward from consumer and culture, see what's happening on digital and sort of see what pieces need to fit together to deliver on those objectives. I think that's one of the reasons as to why I'm in this field for sure. But it's also one of the reasons that's helped me stay consistent in sharpening certain skills that are required in today's market. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, when I graduated, the conversation was moving towards, we should start thinking about digital, we should start thinking about data. Today, that's not a choice anymore. You have to know how to handle data. It's an expectation of a brand strategist to be as comfortable looking at consumer ethnography, decoding cultural semiotics, understanding what semiotics really means itself, and also being able to look through sales data, being able to segment markets, looking through Excel sheets, data, analyzing it, being conversant with platforms like GWI, data from Euromonitor, and then coming out with a robust strategy that combines the so-called left and right.
And you see that in the graduates that you meet when you do hiring. Is that something that traditional education takes care of? Because here at the Altera Institute, of course, we try and make sure that the curriculum is super contemporary. That's why we're in partnership with some of industry's best marketing organizations to do that. But do you see that in general as a trend amongst graduates?
I think when it comes to graduates, everybody's aware that this is the expectation today. That, I need to know how digital marketing works. I need to know what performance marketing is. I need to know the entire cycle of a consumer journey. In today's time, where a consumer journey is completely different, this kind of expectation or this kind of realization from consumers and marketing grads is not always met by institutes. I feel like institutes are also trying to really come up with interesting accreditations, certifications. But of course, there's a certain time period which it takes. People do go to, say, institutes like Altera to make sure that they have the marketing brain, the acumen that's required today. But I think we've got a long way to go in between which we can make it accessible, affordable, and sharply usable by today's marketing and advertising industry.
Right. If you had to just draw a contrast, because of course you teach here at the Altera Institute, on how what you covered for the students at Altera is different in some way versus what you studied in the classroom almost a decade ago now.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the most interesting conversations that I've had with the students is how to start seeding in, how to start from a data-informed perspective to make sure that your narrative is good. So the linking of the left brain and the right brain is really important. Some of what we were all taught back then does a really good job of this. And I feel that without that foundation, it just wouldn't have happened as intuitively as it's happened perhaps for me. So definitely credit where credit is due. And I feel that as we go along, this kind of linking is going to be more important. So more conversations with students on how do you not view data as their job and how do you not view culture as somebody else's domain, but how do you become that one repository which is able to connect both of them. You don't have to be a specialist in either, but you have to know how to be the bridge that connects both the worlds.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for sharing your insights, not only with the students at here at the Altera Institute, but with our audience, especially drawing from your experience of work from H&M and 7-Up and Philips. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been super insightful. Thank you for being here again.
Thanks so much, Aalekh. Happy to be here.